Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so okay, quick agenda then, just what I'm gonna kind of cover this evening. So I'm just gonna kind of introduce what is a transition diet, and then we're just gonna kind of cover essentially the importance of them, and why we should be feeding them. Then we'll kind of delve a little bit into the biology of the cow, and just kind of talk about how feed influences that. Look at best practice then, so how we can transition diet, and then we'll just kind of round off a little bit at the end, just to see what happens when we don't. So essentially, what is a transition diet? So I tend to kind of divide a transition diet into kind of one or two things. The first one is essentially a transition diet is a period of time before an animal changes production demand. So animals have a nutritional requirement for maintenance, which is just to basically to keep them alive, and then they have a demand for whatever production on top of that. So for example, there will be a nutritional requirement for when the animal is pregnant, but then when she calves, there's obviously a massive change in nutritional demand for lactation. So obviously this is more obvious in dairy cows, but lest we forget our suckler cows as well. So there tends to be a transition diet requirement to when changing production demand. The second point then, probably a little bit more applicable, is effectively a period of time then before an animal changes diet. So this is more like when an animal is on the same production demand, so growth, for example, but the diet changes. So the perfect example is when you've got young calves during the rearing phase, they have their maintenance requirement plus requirement for growth. They then kind of move on to that growing phase, and then finally they move on to that finishing phase. And it's really this second point then that I want to just kind of delve into a little bit deeper. This graph here is it's not too complicated. I'll try and explain it, but essentially what we're looking at here is this graph exemplifies then effectively how the cow grows, or all mammals for that matter. So even humans like us. So essentially what happens is what the body does is the body prioritizes what parts it grows and develops. So if you take that point of birth, the animal, so let's talk about a cow then. So a calf is born effectively with a fully functioning nervous system and all of its vital organs, because all of that point from the point of conception, that's what the body has been prioritizing. And as soon as that animal is born, it kind of reduces that priority on developing the nerves and the organs. And now it starts to prioritize the growth and development of the skeleton. So that next light blue peak there is that bone growth. And that's kind of coincides with our rearing phase. And then once the animal has built that frame, it then obviously lays all of that muscle on top. And so it reduces the priority on bone, increases the priority on muscle mass. And then towards the end, once all of that bone is grown, the muscle is grown, all of that is prioritized off. And now we focus our attention on putting fat on. So as you can see then at the bottom, each stage of an animal's life requires different nutritional requirements. So that rearing phase is focused a lot more on protein to help provide the building blocks for that skeleton, and low starch to discourage fat. We don't want fat on at that point. And then as that animal grows into the growing, obviously still needs that requirement for protein and stop that starch. And then we get into the finishing. We've built our skeleton, we've put on our muscle. We don't need the protein anymore. Now we want to focus on fat, so we need that starch. So the key kind of message really from here is diet change is a necessity. In order to feed our animals to get the best from them, we do need to change the diet effectively. So what I want to do now is I just want to delve in a little bit deeper into that actual diet, and let's actually talk about and understand a little bit more about the rumen environment. And so effectively, we all know the rumen is full of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, various other different bits and pieces. And effectively, from a nutritional or a dietitian's point of view, is the way I've always looked at it is whenever I formulate a diet, I'm not formulating a diet for the cow. I'm formulating a diet for that microbial population in the rumen, because effectively what happens is the microbes in the rumen, they're the ones that take the food, they're the ones that ferment it, they break it down, and what they do is they produce the waste products of their fermentation. That's what the cow absorbs. So effectively, that nutrient absorption of the cow is solely dependent on the microbial fermentation of the feed. That's the key thing. But in terms of a transition diet, then what we also have to know is there are particular strains of microbes within the rumen that will ferment particular types of feedstuffs. So you'll have some bacteria in there that will only ferment and break down fiber or only starch. So you can't just chuck any old food in there and expect the bacteria to be there. So when we do change the diet, the first thing that has to adapt are those microbes. And that's really key. And that's kind of what we're focusing on here today. So because different microbes produce different waste products as part of their fermentation of the feed, we need to kind of look at how that then affects the metabolism of the animal. So if we just have a look at energy, so there's three sources of energy then. So the first one is sugar. So don't worry too much about all the sciencey stuff, but effectively when sugar goes into the rumen, particular microbes will ferment that sugar, they'll break it down, and they will produce an acid called butyric acid. And that butyric acid is then absorbed by the cow. It goes into a metabolic pathway called the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle produces ATP. And ATP is basically a source of energy for the animal's cells. So the cells use that ATP to regenerate. And examples of sugar then that we feed are things like molasses, fodder beet, and also grass. So the energy found in grass is our sugars. The second source of energy then is fiber. So again, fiber is broken down, but it produces a different acid called acetic acid. But again, it goes down the same metabolic pathway, the Krebs cycle, to produce ATP. Examples of fiber then that we know of: straw and hay, obvious ones. Palm kernel and soy hulls are other examples. And then the third type of energy is starch. And starch again produces a different type of acid called propionic. Now the difference here is propionic acid is absorbed by the cow, but it doesn't go into the Krebs cycle. It goes down a different metabolic pathway called gluconeogenesis. And effectively what gluconeogenesis is the cow is producing her own glucose. So she uses propionic acid from starch, she produces her own glucose, and she can use that glucose for more energy. But if there's an excess of it, again, just like us, she will store it. Glucose is a storable compound, and it will be stored as fat. And that is why our starch sources, so our cereal grains and potatoes, that's why they are such a key ingredient in our finishing diets. Because they effectively allow the cow to produce glucose, which we then store as fat. So that's kind of our energy sources. If we then kind of move over to our sources of protein, again, two main kind of types of or sources of protein, ERDP, which stands for effective rumen degradable protein. And basically this type of protein is readily available to the microorganisms within the rumen. And what they do is they take that protein, they chop it all up into its amino acids. They then take those amino acids and they break them down even further into what is called amine groups, which is essentially ammonia. And what the microbes then do is, in what you would probably consider a very inefficient system, is they then remake those amino acids. But what the microbes do is they make the particular amino acids that they want. It's all about them, because the microbial organisms have only got one thing on their mind, and that's to reproduce, to create more. And what, as you can see from the diagram, is effectively what you have to think of is there is always a constant flow, there's always a constant movement of food from the mouth through the digestive system and out the back end. So the microbial protein is effectively the microbes themselves. So the microbes themselves pass through the rumen into the abomasum, the lower intestine, and the cow absorbs the actual microbes there, and that is a source of protein for the cow. So it's really important that we obviously get those microbes working for us, because they're the ones who are doing all the digesting and fermenting for us, but they're actually a really good source of protein for the cow. Also, so if we're feeding our cow a really high source of ERDP, then we can get a lot of ammonia build up in the rumen that's too much for the microbes to produce their new amino acids. And what that ammonia can do is it absorbs across the rumen wall into the blood, and it's processed in the liver, and it's excreted as in urine. So, this is where if we're talking about protein efficiency, is making sure we're feeding enough protein to our cows that we're not essentially wasting it and they're weeing it on the floor. Sources of ERDP then, so urea is 100% available, because effectively urea is ammonia, so it's like giving the cow an injection of those amine groups. And then other sources are things like rape meal, and also beans are good sources of that ERDP. The other source of protein available to our cows then is bypass, and essentially bypass is just protein that is either really slowly degradable in the rumen and it just passes straight through, but bypass protein is absorbed, it's broken down and absorbed in the abomasum and the lower intestine. And again, sources of bypass are obviously our soya, and also maize gluten meal versus maize gluten feed. So when you're asking for maize gluten, you do need to be a bit more specific, but I'll cover that a little bit more a little bit later. Other sources of both ERDP and bypass then are things like lupins and linseed. So it's quite a kind of topical thing at the minute, the environmental sustainability around soya, the kind of the financial justifications of growing rape meal at the minute. Are there other opportunities to grow alternative sources of protein? Maybe a point for discussion afterwards. But that little point at the bottom is really, really key. So what we must make sure we're doing is we must make sure that we are providing a good balance of energy and protein to feed these microbes. And that is essentially what this graph is showing. So on the left-hand side is the rate of fermentation, and then on the bottom is over time. So to better describe what I'm showing here is, if we do an example then, so the red line then, examples of that red line are things like your urea as a protein source and sugar as energy. So as soon as they go into the rumen, very readily available for fermentation, you get a quick rate of fermentation. And so what you have to do is you just have to make sure you're balancing your source of protein with the correct source of energy, so you get a good balance. The blue line then, in terms of kind of middle of the ground, things like rape meal on the protein side. I've put starch there as a bit of a generic term, but when we break that down into things like wheat is obviously a lot more fizzy and will be slightly over to the left-hand side. Whereas maize is actually a lot slower degrading. although maize has got a higher starch content than wheat, it's actually slower degrading, which actually makes it safer for the rumen because it's not producing such a high amount of acid, propionic acid that would be, in a short amount of time, and that's where you can get acidosis issues. So again, maize, that's why maize tends to be quite a common ingredient in finishing diets, because we get a lot of starch from it, we can feed a lot of it, and it just tends to be a bit safer. And then slower fermenting feeds, so fiber that we know of, so straw and hay, we know that they ferment a lot slower in the rumen, but also soya. And effectively, that's why soya is such a high proportion of bypass protein, because it just degrades so slow in the rumen that by the time it's been in the rumen and it's passed out, it's passed through into the abomasum and the lower intestine, and it's broken down there instead of really in the rumen. So that's why that is. Just going back then to our maize gluten feed versus maize gluten meal. So the process of extracting starch from maize to produce bioethanol, effectively you can get two different waste products within that process. You get maize gluten feed, which is essentially all of the husk, and you get all the maize gluten meal. And what you end up with is maize gluten meal is a lot higher in protein than maize gluten feed, but it's also a lot slower degrading. So even within the same type of feed source, there are quite key differences that we have to be aware of. And another example of that would be distillers products. So wheat distillers is a lot more readily fermentable compared to maize distillers. So again, even within the same type of feed, there are differences. So just moving on to, kind of best practice and how's the best way to approach transition diets. So what are our kind of key aims and objectives? Essentially, what we're trying to achieve in a transition diet is it's all to do with preparation. So we're trying to prepare the rumen for that change that is on the horizon. And we're giving the rumen time to adapt and to build that appropriate population of microbes that we need, that are going to do the job of fermenting the new diet. And what we also tend to find is with a transition diet, the timing of that can also coincide with maybe a change of environment for the animal, whether it's from outdoors coming indoors, or it might be, you might group animals, you might introduce new animals. So there's a lot of different stresses, environmental stress, social stress on the animal. If we can reduce the nutritional stress on the animal, then again, that will benefit our overall performance. Now, the graph that you can see on the right-hand side is just an example then of, say, in an indoor situation, what we can do is, and one option is step feeding. So essentially, over a certain time period, you just slowly reduce the proportions of say, the original diet, and until you eventually end up on your targeted diet. And I've used that graph for over a 10-day period, but that is fairly flexible. So I tend to say a 10 to 14 day is an average transition period, but that just depends on the kind of the extent of that change. So for example, if you've got cows out to grass, you're bringing them in onto grass silage, then probably a transition day of only a week is probably adequate. But if you're bringing them in from outdoors onto a maize silage, you have to remember that grass has got no starch in it. The energy source is in sugars. Now you're going to be feeding them a maize-based diet, which has got starch. So you have to give that rumen the time to populate itself with those starch fermenting bacteria. So, add another week onto that, maybe give them a couple of weeks, and it's just taking a silage trailer out and just introducing a bit of maize for a couple of weeks will benefit them. But then again, if you're going from a grass-based diet to maybe a really intensive barley concentrate-based finishing diet, we can use creep feeders there over, say, a 3-week period. I mean, personally, I would even start introducing creep feeders, even if it's just a kilo a day or something for, you know, even if it's 2 months before they're due to come in, because that is a fairly extreme change that they will need adaptation to, especially if they're going ad lib. So just to finish off then, to kind of summarize, it's transition feeding really is all to do with the old adage of fail to prepare to fail. And effectively what we're looking at then is, if you don't prepare the rumen, then you will get reduced fermentation. And if you get reduced fermentation by the microbes because they're not adapted to this new change of diet, then you'll end up with a reduced degradation of the feed, and therefore we won't be getting those waste products that the cow needs to absorb. So you get reduced absorption. If you're getting reduced absorption, then effectively that animal is not getting the nutrients it needs, you know, for, you know, whether it is for growth, but also for maintenance. So the cow can't even look after itself, and so you get a reduction in overall health. And if we have effectively unhealthy animals that are struggling, then we will get reduced productivity and thus reduced performance. And that kind of leaves me to seamlessly hand over to Alan, who can pick up a little bit on that, on the effect of performance. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Chris. Right. So I will endeavour to share my screen. I'm just very conscious of working with a technology company here, and I'm not the best with technology, so we will give this a go. So bear with, as they say. But hopefully you should be able to see some pictures of some Belgian blues there. So yeah, so Chris has very much just set the scene, very much at a scientific level of what happens to these animals, and gives a good insight into what's going on within the animal's rumen and stomach, and how we have to balance that feed. I'm not a nutritionist, so I have to put my faith into the nutritionists, and I work with a number of farmers, beef farmers as well, and I look at the performance and we see how those animals are going. So I've got one of my clients that I work with, and we've got this pretty typical growth chart that you'll all be familiar with. So we've got a bunch of 30 animals. This was originally, they were coming in at around about 4.5 months worth of age. And we've got the black line takes out the average. The darker orange line that we've got coming on here is the top 25 and the bottom 25%. And then the outliers are shown on the widest points going throughout. So these animals were on the farm for an average about just under 15 months, and I think, and they grew overall. The overall average performance was just under a kilo, about 950 grams per day. It's a forage-based system, so again, the farmer's trying to do as much from forage as possible. So overall, he was quite pleased with it, but I have that target of at least we should be doing a kilo a day. Throughout the lifetime they're on the farm, and he wasn't sure where he was going, wasn't quite getting it. There's a few dips, as you can see, that we get, which we knew was something was going on. So we sort of I set in the challenge that I think we should weigh a bit more often, and perhaps we can help identify what's going on. And so these are the same batch of animals, but rather than just looking over the lifetime now of how these animals went on and performed, we were looking at trying to record and weigh them every sort of 4 weeks. So what we've got here, I've called it a T1, which is the first transition period. So how we would traditionally manage these animals, they'd arrive on farm, they've been on quite a high concentrate usage from the farm they were arriving from. So in those first 4 weeks, he continues to feed quite a lot of concentrates, but he like sort of 4 weeks on concentrates, feeding them they have access to silage as well. But then after 4 weeks, he just cuts the concentrate straight off. So we were then seeing a drop in performance. These animals arrive around about January time. So what you can see is what Chris was alluding to. Once they've had a period of time, they were getting used to the forage. You see that their growth rates then now start to pick up again. And he houses, he has to turn out because of availability. He has to take his first cut because these were deemed as younger animals before he turns out. So you can see how they sort of plateaued well once they settled onto the forage system into around week 20, 24. At that point, that's when he had the grass to go and turn them out. And the animals then performed quite well while they were at grass, steadily improving. So that's the T2, but that's transfer out from silage onto the better quality grass that we've got. So they performed well out at grass. And then we hit T3. Now, how he likes to manage it is once they're outside and they're at grass, his view is very much that grass is cheaper than bringing them in. It's less hassle. So we'll keep them out as long as possible. But because we're getting them to weigh them more regularly, we went from a growth rate of about 1.3, just under 1.3 for the groups. The next time we were down to just under the kilo. So obviously they weren't performing. And the bit that I've tried to reiterate him is it's all very well looking at the average. So we've got an average there that's doing just under a kilo. That means some are still performing better than that. So some are still performing at over a kilo a day. But obviously some of them are going to be down at around about 500, 600 grams, which just isn't enough growth. So he whipped them, shut them in the shed and put them on forage. But his forage, because this is now he's thinking, starting to put them into the finishing period, was predominantly maize. And again, that's why we see a big check there in the growth, because obviously they've come off grass silage, as sort of Chris has alluded to before, straight onto maize. So we, again, even though we housed them, we saw such a significant drop in the performance over those 4-week period. Again, once they settled and they got the ration balanced and the cattle were all settled in, performance was going quite well throughout. And then I put it in there just as it's a T4, but it's not actually a T4 because there's a bunch of animals we were monitoring all the way through. These are the ones which we're then left with in T4. So the higher performing animals start leaving and being sold out of the business first. But by around week 68 to 76, that's when we've got our poorer performing animals remaining on there. So overall, the growth rate then isn't being pulled through. But by presenting in it and looking at it that way, that gave us a different insight and made us realize that, yeah, we need to be managing these transitions. And so we need to do a lot better job. What I tried to do for him then was also to try and put that into what I call things that I can relate to. So what did that really mean for this farmer? So if I took at every point in time when those animals were under the average of 940 grams, I reckon we lost around about 27 kilos of growth for these animals. And in order to get that 27 kilos back, that meant in addition, they were basically on the unit for around 30 additional days, which isn't significant, but it's still another 30 days than they needed to be. Now, for this guy, his overhead costs around about 78 pence per day. So when I say overhead, that's not including feed, that's not including bedding or medicine. So this is all pure fixed cost elements, labour, machinery, fuel, rents. So his overhead cost is in at 78 pence. That's costed him an extra, I think, £23.40 per head for that performance and those checks that we were seeing. His straw cost at the time was around 25 pence a day, so that's another £7.50 per head that I think it was costing him. So we've got a collective then for this of around about just under £31, and I think those checks and the way he was managing those animals during that transition were impacting him, which for that group of animal was around about 927, just under £1,000. And so, well, again, it doesn't seem a lot for the business that he was running, the animals he was putting through, so just under £15,500 for the year. So it's this point that we suddenly, he realized that, yeah, those little checks and the way that I'm doing it, I should spend more time. I need to focus on those. That's what I need to do differently. the advantage of one of the advantages I see is when I look across species is how they manage things in different sectors. So when I look at the pork sector, although everybody says, oh, it's very different because they're all intensive and they're all indoors, what they're actually really good at is knowing throughout the stages that those pigs go through, how they're meant to perform, what they're expected to perform at, and how their feed needs to be adjusted accordingly. And I think that's something that I think is quite key for yourselves as producers now. That there's no more, from what I understand, you're all up at your game of beef productions. There's probably not many more easy and quick wins for you guys out there. So it's trying to identify some of the smaller areas that there are still advantages and still wins to be having. And I find on most units, when we focus on and look at the transition period, this is one of the areas where most businesses can gain something from. Now for this guy, like I said, he was taking those animals in from about 4.5 months all the way through. So it depends on the type of systems that you've got. And listening to you guys just doing your introductions, we've got some stronger store finishers, we've got some suckler finishers there as well. But the same principle still applies, and it's an area that I spend a lot of time talking to farmers with, trying to just help them understand from a financial point of view why I believe it's worthwhile trying to invest into it. But that's sort of my point over with, because Chris did a great job of setting the scene. So that's sort of what I just wanted to put on it, because I think there's Ian said he wanted to sort of set this up to up for discussion. So I will endeavour to stop sharing and sort of see what you guys sort of think, and hopefully see each other again. But yeah, it's sort of over to Ian and you guys.
Thank you, Alan. And on the back of preparing this presentation, we've actually put that report into the web, so you can actually see your own growth rates on a 4-weekly basis if you want to go in and analyze it within the breeder report. So Alan was a big help for that. So in terms of questions, is there any specific, I'm just going to stop the recording, so apologies.